The mirror under the water. Remembering the self that the world could not reach. Introduction. Before the first word. I want you to notice something before we begin. Not in a moment. Right now. Notice that you chose this. Out of everything available to you in this exact stretch of time, some part of you reached for something that promised depth rather than distraction. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Because that reach, that small, quiet, almost invisible motion towards something more real than the noise, that is the most important thing you have done today. Maybe in a long time. Most people will not notice that choice. Most people will treat what just happened as automatic, as a random click, as something the algorithm delivered and they passively received. But you are not most people. You would not be here if you were. And the part of you that knows the difference between a random click and a genuine reaching, that part is exactly who this recording is for. Here is what I know about you, without knowing anything about you at all. There is a version of your life that you can see from the corner of your eye. Not the life you have, but the life you sense you were built for. It does not look dramatically different from the outside. It is not a fantasy of wealth or fame or escape. It is subtler than that and more specific. It is the feeling of moving through your days with a quality of aliveness that is mostly absent now, of saying what you actually think, of making choices that come from your own center rather than from the accumulated pressure of everyone else's expectations, of waking up in the morning with a reason to get up that belongs to you and not to the obligations that have quietly claimed most of your hours. You have seen that version, in flashes, in moments between the busyness when something opened briefly and you caught a glimpse and felt, for just a second, what it would feel like to actually be yourself without apology. And then it closed again. This recording is about why it closes, and how to hold it open. Not through discipline or effort or any of the self-improvement strategies you have already tried and found wanting, through something much simpler, through the one thing that the noise has been specifically designed to prevent you from doing, through seeing clearly. There is a mirror under the water of your life, beneath the surface activity, beneath the performing and the managing and the getting through the day, beneath the stories you tell about who you are and why things are the way they are, there is a surface that reflects something true, something older than your biography, and steadier than your moods, and more real than any label that has ever been applied to you. This journey is not about building a better version of yourself. It is about clearing the water so you can see what is already there. That is the whole thing. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The glass you have been living inside. There is a phenomenon in architecture called a glass box effect. When you are inside a building made of glass, in the daytime, you can see everything outside with perfect clarity. The street, the people, the weather, the whole moving world. But from the outside, in the same daylight, anyone looking toward the building cannot see in. They see only the reflection of their own world thrown back at them. The glass appears opaque, a mirror. The same building, different experience depending entirely on which side of the glass you are standing on. Most people spend their entire lives on the inside of a particular glass box, and the box was built so early and so gradually that they have completely forgotten it is there. They are looking out through it constantly, believing they are seeing the world directly, when in fact, they are seeing the world through a structure that was assembled by other hands, in other times, for purposes that had very little to do with their actual well-being. The box is made of conclusions, not opinions or preferences, which are soft and changeable. Conclusions, the hardened, settled, treated as permanent decisions about what is real, what is possible, what you deserve, and what the world is like, that were made mostly before you were old enough to evaluate whether they were actually true. A child is told, directly or through the far more powerful medium of repeated experience, that expressing a particular emotion is not safe. That conclusion gets filed as fact. It shapes every relationship thereafter, not as a choice, but as a physical reflex. The way a hand pulls back from a hot surface without consulting the brain. The adult who was that child does not experience themselves as holding a conclusion. They experience themselves as simply knowing something about human nature, about how things work. The conclusion has become invisible. It has become the glass. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that the snake that cannot shed its skin must perish. He was talking about the necessity of releasing old interpretations of oneself in order to continue growing. But what he did not fully address, and what is worth our time here, is the fact that most people do not know they have a skin to shed. The old interpretation is invisible. It is not experienced as an interpretation. It is experienced as truth. Here's the test of whether you are inside a glass box. Ask yourself this question and let the answer land honestly before your thinking mind has the chance to shape it into something more acceptable. Where in your life do you consistently experience the same difficult outcome with different people in different circumstances across long stretches of time? Where does the same story keep ending the same way? That consistency is not bad luck. Luck varies, circumstances vary, people vary. The one constant in every version of that repeating story is you, which means the one thing with the power to change the story is also you, not by trying harder or behaving differently on the surface, but by finding the conclusion inside the glass and examining it honestly enough to ask, is this actually true, or is this only something I decided was true in a moment that has long since passed? The glass box is not your enemy. It was built by a younger version of you doing genuinely intelligent work with the information available at the time. It deserves acknowledgement for the protection it provided. And then it deserves to be walked out of. You cannot walk out of it until you can see it. This entire journey is about learning to see the glass. Chapter 2: What Grows in the Dark. Let me tell you about a tree called the bristlecone pine. It grows in the high deserts of the western part of North America. At altitudes where the soil is shallow, the wind is constant, and the temperatures swing between extremes that would kill most living things. The bristlecone pine does not merely survive these conditions, it becomes extraordinary because of them. The oldest living bristlecone pine is estimated to be nearly 5,000 years old. It was a sapling before most of the great civilizations whose names we still recognize had formed. It has been standing through everything for longer than recorded human history. Here's what makes it structurally possible. The very conditions that make the bristlecone's environment inhospitable are the conditions that produce its extraordinary density. The cold slows its growth to almost nothing. A single inch of new growth can represent a decade of work. The wood that forms under these conditions is so dense, so tightly compressed, so full of resin, that it is essentially impervious to rot and disease. The harshest environments produce the most durable material. Your difficulty has been doing exactly this. Not as a consolation, not as a reframe designed to make suffering feel useful in retrospect, but as a plain and observable structural fact. The places in your life where growth was hardest, where you were forced to develop something you would never have developed in easier conditions, where you were stripped of the easy solutions and had to find something real, those places produce the most compressed, the most durable, the most genuinely yours material in your character. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who spent years in a concentration camp and emerged to write one of the most important books of the 20th century, made an observation that sits at the foundation of everything we are going to discuss today. He said that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. The space he was talking about is the most important real estate in your life. It is not a large space. In the beginning, it may be barely perceptible, a microsecond between the trigger and the automatic reaction, between the familiar situation and the familiar suffering it reliably produces. But it exists. It has always existed. And every time you manage, even partially, to inhabit that space rather than bypassing it on the way to the automatic response, it grows. Not dramatically, not like a switch being thrown, like the bristlecone pine, slowly, under pressure, into something extraordinarily dense and durable. Here is a practice that costs nothing and returns more than it costs. For the next 3 days, every time you feel yourself about to react in a familiar way to a familiar kind of situation, introduce a single breath before you do. Not a therapeutic breath, not a performance of mindfulness, just one breath, used as a physical prompt to occupy the space for a single second before the automatic pattern fires. You are not trying to change the reaction. You are only trying to locate the space. Once you can locate it reliably, everything else becomes possible, but you cannot work with something you cannot find. The difficulty you are currently carrying is not evidence that something went wrong. It is evidence that something is growing, dense, slow, impervious to rot. The bristlecone pine does not grow despite the conditions. It grows because of them. Chapter 3. The Role You Never Auditioned For. Here is something almost nobody talks about honestly. Most people are living a life that was written for them before they were old enough to have a say. Not metaphorically, practically. The family you were born into had a system. Every family does. A particular set of roles that needed to be filled in order for the system to function, or at least to maintain the particular kind of dysfunction it was used to. Someone needed to be the responsible one. Someone needed to be the funny one that relieved the tension. Someone needed to carry the anxiety so that others could rest from it. Someone needed to achieve enough to justify the family's sense of itself. Someone needed to fail enough to confirm the family's fears. You were assigned one of these roles before you could speak in full sentences. Not through a conversation, not through a deliberate decision anyone made, but through the relentless, invisible feedback mechanism of family life, through what got rewarded, what got ignored, what made the adults around you relax and what made them tighten, what produced warmth and what produced withdrawal. And you, being a small and remarkably intelligent creature who understood intuitively that your survival depended on the emotional state of the people responsible for you, learned to play the role with extraordinary precision. The problem is not that you learned it. Learning it was smart. The problem is that most people never get the memo that the original production closed a long time ago. They go on performing the role long after the audience has changed, long after the context that required the role no longer exists, because the role has become indistinguishable from their sense of self. They are not performing the responsible one. They are the responsible one. They are not performing the one who does not ask for too much. They are the one who does not ask for too much. The sociologist Irving Goffman spent his career studying what he called the presentation of self in everyday life. His central argument was that human social interaction is fundamentally theatrical, that we are all, always, performing versions of ourselves calibrated for the particular audience in front of us. His work was brilliant and his observations were accurate, but he stopped one step short of the most important question, which is, what happens when the performance has been running so long that the performer has forgotten there is a stage? What happens is the peculiar specific exhaustion of someone who has been on for too long without a break. You know this exhaustion. It is not in the muscles. It is the exhaustion of constant self-management, of the gap between what you actually feel and what you are presenting, of the energy required to maintain the performance, to remember your lines, to hit your marks, to give the people around you the version of you that they have been trained to expect and that you have been trained to provide. The invitation here is not to blow up the role, not to have a confrontational conversation, or to abruptly stop being the person everyone around you has organized their expectations around. Those kinds of dramatic gestures are usually more about releasing the pressure of the performance than about genuine change. And they tend to produce chaos without clarity. The invitation is simpler and ultimately more radical. It is to become curious about the role rather than identified with it. To begin asking not out loud but internally, is this response mine or is this the role? Is this opinion something I actually hold or something the character I play would say? Is this discomfort the discomfort of a situation that is genuinely difficult, or the discomfort of a situation where who I actually am and who I am performing are getting too far apart to maintain? The distinction, held consistently over time, begins to create the space for something that is not a role at all. Something that was there before the production started, and has been waiting, with impressive patience, for the curtain to come down. Chapter 4. The Thermostat and the Temperature. There is a concept in engineering called a set point. It is the value a control system is designed to maintain. In your home thermostat, the set point is the temperature you program. When the room gets colder, the heating activates. When it gets warmer, the cooling activates. The system is always working, in both directions, to return the environment to the set point, not to a better temperature, not to a more comfortable temperature, to the specific one it was programmed for. You have set points. Not for temperature, for everything that matters. For how much love you allow yourself to receive before finding a way to create distance, for how much success you accumulate before doing something that quietly undermines it, for how visible and respected and recognized you are willing to be before the discomfort of that visibility starts to generate self-sabotaging behavior, for how good things can get before some part of you begins to work, industriously and entirely beneath your conscious awareness, to return them to the familiar level. The psychologist Hendricks called this the upper limit problem. His observation, drawn from decades of work with high-functioning people, was that most individuals have an unconscious ceiling on how much happiness, success, and love they are willing to sustain. Not an intentional ceiling, a programmed one. And when life pushes them toward or beyond that ceiling, they activate, without knowing they are doing it, the behaviors that reliably bring the temperature back down to the set point. They start an unnecessary argument with the person they love, just as the relationship reaches a new depth. They get sick at the exact moment a professional opportunity requires their best performance. They procrastinate on the project that would take them somewhere genuinely new, until the window closes. They find a way, always specifically suited to their particular psychology, to ensure that things do not stay better than they were programmed to be. Read that again slowly, not as self-criticism, as information. Where is your set point for good? Not the good you perform on social media, not the good you project when things are going well and you want to believe it is sustainable. The inner set point, the level of consistent well-being above which something in you starts to get uncomfortable and begins to work against itself. For most people, the set point was calibrated in childhood and adolescence by the emotional environment they were surrounded by. If the baseline was anxious, the nervous system learned to treat anxiety as normal and calm as a temporary aberration that will soon self-correct. If the baseline was chaotic, the nervous system learned to generate small amounts of chaos in quiet periods because the quiet felt more threatening than the storm. If the baseline was emotionally cold, the nervous system learned to distrust warmth as a precursor to the withdrawal that always followed it. The thermostat is not you. It is a system installed in you before you had any say in the installation. And like any installed system, it can be examined and adjusted, and over time replaced with a setting that reflects not the emotional climate of the household you grew up in, but the one you are capable of sustaining right now. The adjustment is not made by forcing yourself to be happier or by willing the self-sabotage to stop. It is made in the moment of recognition, the moment when you notice, oh, something in me is doing the thing again. Something in me is finding a reason to return the temperature to the old setting. And in that moment of noticing, you make a single different choice, not a permanent vow. One different choice. Stay in the warmth a little longer this time. Allow the good a little more room. Let the ceiling hold, rather than reaching for the mechanism that lowers it. Over time, the set point shifts, not because you forced it to, because you stopped actively defending it. The thermostat is not the limit of your capacity. It is only the limit of what you have so far been willing to sustain. Sustain a little more today. Chapter 5. The Cartographer's Error. In the age of exploration, before satellite imagery and precise instruments, cartographers faced a recurring problem. The maps they drew were necessarily incomplete. Large sections of territory remained uncharted, unknown, outside the range of any expedition that had yet returned with reliable data. The cartographers had to make a decision about what to do with those blank spaces. Some of them simply left them blank, an honest acknowledgement of the limits of knowledge. Others, and this is the historically significant choice, filled the blank spaces with monsters. Literally. The phrase "here be dragons" appears on the edges of certain historical maps, drawn not because there was any evidence of dragons in those regions, but because an unknown that was imagined as threatening was somehow more manageable than an unknown that was simply unknown. The monster, even a terrifying one, at least had a shape. It could be planned for, prepared against. It gave the blankness a form that the human mind could organize its fear around. Here is what this has to do with your life. Your mind does the same thing with the unknown regions of your future and your potential. When you approach the edge of what is familiar, when you stand at the border of the life you know and look out toward the life that is possible but not yet real, your internal cartographer, working from the same principle as those ancient mapmakers, fills the blank spaces with monsters. The monster of failure, the monster of rejection, the monster of being seen and found lacking, the monster of success and what it might demand of you, and whether you could sustain it, the monster of the relationship that might actually be different from every previous one, and whether you could survive it if it eventually ended the way the others did. These monsters feel extraordinarily real. They have the full weight of imagined consequence behind them. They generate the same physiological stress response, the raised heartbeat, the tightened chest, the narrowed thinking, as a real and present danger. And the mind, being an organ that evolved to prioritize survival over accuracy, treats them as real. It treats the imagined territory as mapped. It treats the dragons as confirmed residents. But they are cartographers' errors. They are the mind's attempt to make the unknown manageable by giving it a shape. And the shape it chooses is almost always worse than the reality. The research on this is both clear and slightly humbling. Human beings are genuinely poor at predicting how bad things will feel, and how long that feeling will last. The psychologist Daniel Gilbert, who spent years studying what he called affective forecasting, found consistently that people overestimate the negative emotional impact of bad outcomes and underestimate their own capacity to adapt, recover, and find meaning in the aftermath. We imagine the monster is fatal. We are almost always wrong about that. Which means the blank spaces on your map are almost certainly less monstrous then your cartographer has drawn them. The failure you are afraid of will not feel, if it comes, the way you imagine it will feel. The rejection will not last as long as you fear. The territory is unknown, yes, but unknown is not the same as dangerous. Unknown is only unknown. Here is what I want you to try. Think of one thing you have been not doing because of the dragons drawn on that part of your map, not something dangerous or reckless. One small, genuine thing you want to do or say or attempt or begin, that has been staying in the category of not yet because the cartographer has made the territory look impassable. Go there this week. A small expedition, not a conquest, just a look at whether what is actually there matches what was drawn on the map. It almost never does. The dragons were always ink. Chapter 6. Gravity and Grace. Most people relate to their own potential, the way early scientists related to the question of flight. It was acknowledged as theoretically interesting. It was admired from a safe distance. It was understood abstractly as something that happened somewhere to things. But it was not considered a practical reality for this particular person in this particular situation with these particular constraints. And then someone changed not the laws of physics, but their relationship to the question. The Wright brothers did not discover something new about air or gravity. What they discovered was that a previously assumed limitation was not a law, but a problem. A solvable problem. They changed the question from why can't humans fly to what would need to be true for humans to fly, and that shift in question changed what they were able to see. Your limitations are mostly the first kind of question disguised as the second. They feel like laws. They present themselves with the authority of physics, as settled matters, as things that simply are the way they are. I am not creative. I am not the kind of person who succeeds at things like that. I am too old, too far behind, too compromised by choices that cannot be unmade. These sentences arrive in the mind with the same certainty as the statement that objects fall downward. They feel like descriptions of reality. Most of them are descriptions of history. There is a distinction there that is worth sitting with. A description of reality is a statement about what is true now, under current conditions, given current inputs. A description of history is a statement about what was true then, under then conditions, with then inputs, for a then version of you that may have been considerably less resourced, less experienced, less clear-eyed, and less free than you currently are. The philosopher William James, who was himself intimately familiar with the experience of believing he was irreparably limited and then discovering he was not, wrote that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. This was not wishful thinking. He was describing something he had observed in himself and in others with the rigorous attention of a scientist applied to the interior landscape. The inner attitude he was referring to is not positivity. It is not the performance of optimism. It is something much more precise. It is the decision to treat a currently closed door as a problem rather than as a permanent feature of the architecture. And here is why this matters beyond the obvious. When you treat something as a problem, your mind does something very specific and very powerful. It begins scanning for solutions. The brain's problem-solving systems, which are genuinely extraordinary pieces of biological engineering, activate when they receive a problem to work on. But they do not activate for things that have been filed as permanent. They only work on things filed as open. The moment you reclassify a limitation from law to problem, you have just assigned your own brain to work on it, not consciously. In the background, in the space between thoughts, in the connections made during sleep, in the peripheral awareness that operates beneath the noise of deliberate thinking. People describe this experience as insight arriving from nowhere, a solution that appeared while they were in the shower or on a walk or in the ambiguous space between waking and sleep. What actually happened is that the problem was filed as open and the brain went to work on it in the vast processing space that lies beneath conscious awareness. You have much more brain working on your behalf than you are consciously directing. But it only works on what you give it to work on. Here is where it gets practical. Take one thing you currently believe about yourself or your circumstances that has the feeling of a law rather than a history. Something that would begin with the phrase, "I am just not someone who." Now, ask this question, not rhetorically, but with genuine investigative curiosity. What evidence would have to exist for this to be a history rather than a law? What would I need to have seen, experienced, or attempted that I have not yet seen, experienced, or attempted? In almost every case, the honest answer is, something I have not done yet. Which means the limitation is not confirmed. It is only so far uncontradicted. And an uncontradicted hypothesis is not a fact. It is a hypothesis waiting for its first serious test. Run the test. Gravity is not the obstacle to flight. It is the constant that makes flight interesting. And your history is not the obstacle to your future. It is the terrain from which everything extraordinary will be launched. Chapter 7, The Conversation You Are Always Having. Here is something that will sound obvious, and will become less obvious the longer you sit with it. You are in a conversation right now, not with me. You are always in a conversation with me, in the sense that you are hearing words and processing them. But underneath that, and underneath every other conversation you will have today, there is a prior conversation that never stops. The one you are having with yourself. Not the conscious, deliberate self-talk of someone working through a problem. The automatic, ambient, background narration that runs under everything. The commentary track. The one that evaluates every situation as it unfolds, assigns meaning to every interaction, keeps score of evidence for and against the central hypothesis it holds about you and the world, and delivers its verdicts in a voice so familiar that it does not even register as a separate voice anymore. It sounds like thinking. It sounds like reality. It is neither. The monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh described what he called the second arrow. When something painful happens, that is the first arrow. It lands, it hurts, it is real. But then, immediately, the mind fires a second arrow, the commentary about the first arrow. The catastrophizing, the generalizing, the "this always happens to me," the "what is wrong with me that this happened." And the suffering from the second arrow is often greater and more sustained than the suffering from the first. Worse, unlike the first arrow, the second is entirely self-inflicted. The conversation you are having with yourself is firing second arrows constantly. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that is almost too simple to take seriously, is that the conversation can be changed. Not by silencing it, which does not work, and not by arguing with it, which tends to give it more energy, but by becoming aware of it as a conversation rather than as a truth. Here is a small and potent experiment. For the next 24 hours, every time you are aware of a thought about yourself, a judgment, an evaluation, a prediction, a story, treat it like a sentence spoken by a character in a film rather than a statement of fact. Do not agree or disagree with it. Simply notice there is a sentence. That sentence has a tone. That sentence is being used as evidence for a particular interpretation. Where is this sentence trying to take me? You will begin to notice patterns that were previously invisible because they were happening too automatically to observe. You will notice that the conversation has favorite routes, favorite conclusions it returns to regardless of the starting point, Favorite fears it uses as exits when the main road gets uncomfortable. Favorite achievements it uses to temporarily quiet the critic before the critic finds the next thing to evaluate. These patterns are not you, they are the conversation you learn to have, mostly by absorbing it from the conversations you were surrounded by when you were young and forming. They are, at this point, almost entirely automatic. But automatic is not the same as fixed. Automatic only means you have been doing it without deciding to. From the moment you begin to observe the conversation, you are no longer entirely inside it. And the moment you are outside it, even partially, even briefly, something genuinely new becomes possible. You can begin, slowly, sentence by sentence, to change the conversation. Not to a false one, not to relentless encouragement delivered in a perky voice that nobody actually believes, to a more accurate one that sees the difficulty and does not catastrophize it, one that registers the achievement without immediately hunting for its flaw, one that can hold the uncertainty of not yet knowing without filing it as evidence of permanent incapacity. A more accurate conversation, that is all. It turns out that is almost everything. Chapter 8. What the River Knows. Consider the river. Not a particular river, the principle of riverness. A river does not arrive at the sea. It becomes the sea, continuously, without ceremony, without a moment of transition that can be identified as the place where river ends and sea begins. It gives itself over in a process so continuous and so complete that the distinction eventually stops being meaningful. It is river until it is not, and then it is something larger. Most people are holding the banks. They know intellectually that they are connected to something larger than their individual story. The evidence for this is everywhere, in the science of interconnected ecosystems, in the psychology of relational attachment, in the simple observable fact that no human being has ever survived infancy alone, that every capability you have was developed in relationship to other people and to a world that preceded you by billions of years, and that you are using a language you did not invent to think thoughts that were made possible by every thinker who came before you. The island self is an illusion. You are not separate from the world. You are a temporarily localized expression of it. And yet, most people grip the banks. They hold themselves together with a kind of desperate coherence that is exhausting to maintain, and that, paradoxically, is the thing keeping them from the expansion that their nature is designed for. The banks are the identity constructions we have been discussing throughout this journey. The glass box, the assigned role, the set point, the cartographer's monsters, the story of the limitation, the conversation with the second arrows. All of them are banks. All of them are the held position against the natural movement towards something larger. Here's the distinction that matters. Letting go of the banks does not mean losing yourself. The river does not lose itself by moving. It is most fully itself in motion. The identity that feels like it needs to be defended, that produces anxiety when threatened, that requires constant maintenance to stay coherent. That identity is not you. It is your current version of the banks. It is the shape you have frozen yourself into in order to feel safe in a world that felt, at various key moments, unsafe for the flowing version of you. The Taoist tradition, which has been thinking about this particular problem for roughly 2,500 years, describes a concept called Wu Wei. It is often translated as non-action, which is misleading. It is more accurately described as action that is not in resistance to the nature of things. Moving with the current rather than against it. Not passivity. Effortless engagement. The full use of your capacity applied in the direction that things are naturally moving, rather than the exhausting work of moving against the grain of your own nature. Think for a moment about the activities in your life where time moves differently, where you look up and an hour has passed when you were certain it had been 10 minutes, where the effort does not feel like effort in the normal sense, not because it is easy, but because the exertion is aligned with something. Where you feel in the middle of the doing more like yourself than you do in most other circumstances. These are not random. They are not mere preferences, like a preference for one flavor over another. They are information about your grain, about the direction in which your energy moves without the resistance that most activities produce. Most people have been taught to distrust this information. The things that feel natural are treated with suspicion, as though they cannot be genuinely valuable precisely because they do not require suffering to access. Worth, in most of the cultural frameworks we grow up inside, is proportional to difficulty. The things that cost most are most valued. The things that come easily are suspect. But consider the alternative framework, the one the river embodies. The river does not consider the path of least resistance to be a compromise of its integrity. The path of least resistance is the path. It is the direction gravity calls, and following it is not weakness. It is how the river reaches the sea. What is your grain? Not what you have been told it should be. Not what would look good or make sense or satisfy the people whose approval you have historically needed. Your actual grain, the direction in which your energy moves without resistance, the things you do where time disappears and effort feels like flow rather than effort. That is not an accident of personality. That is information about your direction. The river does not choose to flow downhill. It simply moves according to its nature, and because it moves according to its nature, it eventually reaches the sea. You do not have to figure out the sea. You only have to stop fighting the current that has been trying to take you there. Chapter 9. The Art of Unfinished Business. There is a psychological phenomenon named after a Russian researcher called Bluma Zygarnik. She noticed something curious while observing waiters in a restaurant. They were able to recall with extraordinary precision every detail of the orders that had not yet been delivered to the tables. But the moment an order was completed and the customer was served, the waiter's memory of it deteriorated almost immediately. The unfinished task was held active. The finished one was released. This is your mind's behavior with unfinished emotional business. Every unresolved grief, every unexpressed truth, every relationship that ended without adequate closure, every moment of anger that was swallowed rather than processed, every chapter of your history that was closed without being genuinely finished, these sit in active memory. They occupy processing power. They generate a low-level hum of unfinishedness that, when combined with the dozens of other open files, creates the chronic background noise that most people have come to accept as simply the texture of being alive. It is not the texture of being alive. It is the texture of being alive with a lot of unfinished business. The therapist and author Peter Levine spent decades studying what he called trauma, and he made an observation that significantly expanded the common understanding of the word. He found that unresolved experiences do not merely remain as memories, they remain as incomplete biological responses. The body initiates a response to a threatening or overwhelming experience, and if that response is interrupted, suppressed, or unable to complete its natural cycle, it stays activated. The organism remains in a state of partial readiness that over years becomes indistinguishable from the resting state. You have been braced for something that is no longer coming. Some part of your nervous system is still managing the fallout from something that ended years ago, still preparing for the conversation that was never had, still carrying the posture of someone who was not entirely safe in the way they were not entirely safe at a specific earlier time. The body does not know that time has passed. The body only knows activation and resolution, and without resolution, the activation continues. What this means practically is that some of the heaviness you carry, some of the low-level exhaustion, Some of the inexplicable tightness that lives in the chest, or the jaw, or the space between the shoulder blades, is not about the present. It is about the past that never quite became past. The work of completion is not dramatic. It does not require reliving every difficult experience in vivid detail. It requires only the willingness to turn toward the open file rather than continuing to step around it, to say, internally or in writing or in a conversation with someone you trust, "This happened, I felt something. The feeling was real. I did not fully feel it then because I was not in conditions where it was safe to. I can feel it now." That acknowledgement, made honestly rather than performatively, begins the completion process. Not instantly, not completely, but it begins. And as each file closes, something becomes available that was previously occupied by the holding. Attention, energy, presence, the capacity to be here, actually here, in what is happening now, rather than partially here and partially managing the open files of a past that never quite let you go. You do not have to carry all of it. Some of it is genuinely ready to be set down. The business can be finished. Chapter 10. The name you have not said out loud yet. Here is something I want to offer you, and I want to offer it carefully because it is easy to hear it in a way that makes it smaller than it is. There is a version of your future that you have not let yourself name. Not the version you tell people when they ask about your plans. That is a safe and socially calibrated version, designed to produce approval while protecting you from the exposure that comes with naming something you actually want. Not the version you dismiss quickly in your own mind when it appears, reclassifying it as unrealistic or arrogant, or not the kind of thing that happens to someone like you. The version underneath those. The one that arrives in unguarded moments. The one you sometimes catch yourself inhabiting briefly before the self-monitoring kicks in and files it away. The one that feels simultaneously obvious, as though it has always been there, and frightening, because naming it makes it real enough to fail at. That version. The reason most people never name it out loud, and often never even fully allow themselves to think it clearly, is not because it is impractical. It is because naming something you want is an act of profound vulnerability. It creates the possibility of a specific, personal, unambiguous failure. As long as you keep the wanting vague, you can also keep the not having bearable. But the moment you name it, you have created a gap between here and there that is no longer abstract. It is yours, and the possibility of never crossing it becomes something you have to look directly at rather than feel only as a general background ache. This is the real reason people stay vague about what they want, not because they do not know, because knowing and naming creates a specific kind of exposure that not knowing avoids. The psychologist Gabriele Oettingen spent decades researching the relationship between desire and outcome, and her findings complicated the popular wisdom about positive thinking in a way that is directly relevant here. She found that people who only visualized positive outcomes, who spent time imagining the desired future without also mentally contrasting it with the obstacles and the current reality, actually performed worse on measures of achievement than people who held both the vision and the gap clearly in mind simultaneously. The comfortable dream, held without the friction of honest assessment, becomes a substitute for the action rather than a motivation for it. But she also found something important. The people who held both the dream and the honest assessment of the current distance, who named what they wanted and simultaneously named what was genuinely in the way, those people generated the most energy, the most creative problem-solving, and the most sustained commitment. The naming is not enough. The honest assessment is not enough. Both together create what she called the energized state, the state in which action becomes not a willful discipline but a natural consequence of knowing clearly where you are and where you are going. So here is the invitation. and it requires only a few minutes and more honesty than most conversations ask for. Name the version. Not to me, not to anyone else unless you choose to, but to yourself, clearly and specifically. The version of your life that has been forming in the background, that you have been approaching and retreating from, that you sense is genuinely yours to live if you stop finding reasons to delay it. Name it. Write it down if you can. Say it quietly if writing feels too permanent. But let it be clear rather than vague. Let it be specific rather than general. Let it be yours rather than a safely disguised version of what you think is achievable. And then ask with the same honesty, what is actually in the way? Not the stories about what is in the way, the actual, specific, tangible obstacles. Because named obstacles can be worked with. Unnamed obstacles run the show. The version of you that lives that version of the future is not a different person. It is this person, making different choices, over time, from a clearer position. You are already that person. You are only not yet living as that person. The distance between those two things is smaller than you think. And it begins to close the moment you say the name out loud. Closing, the mirror is already clear. We are at the end of this journey together. And I want to use these final minutes with the same care I would give to the last page of a letter that matters. You came here with something, some version of the searching we talked about at the very beginning. Some version of the sense that there is a life beside or beneath or beyond the one you are currently living, that has more of you in it than the one you are in. You carried that sense here, and you have been carrying it with more patience than it has probably deserved for a long time. I want to tell you something about that. The fact that the searching has persisted, that it has survived the setbacks and the disappointments and the years when the gap seemed impossible to cross and the questions seemed to have no answerable answer. That persistence is not a burden. It is a compass. It is the most reliable piece of navigational equipment available to you, because it cannot be faked and it cannot be permanently suppressed, and it is not pointing at anything outside you. It is pointing at you. Not at the performing version, not at the version built for other people's comfort, at the one underneath. The one that was there before the glass box formed and will be there when every roll has been finally and fully set down. The mirror under the water. Your original face, as the Zen tradition calls it, the face you had before your parents were born. That face has not changed. Everything we have discussed in this recording, every glass box and cartographer's error and thermostat setting and second arrow and open file, all of it is surface. All of it is what got deposited on top of something that remains intact and unchanged, and, as you have perhaps felt in moments throughout these chapters, recognizable. Let me say something about recognition, because I think it is the most important thing I have saved for last. Recognition is different from learning. When you learn something, it is new. It arrives from outside. It adds to what was previously there. When you recognize something, it is not new. It was there. You simply had not looked directly at it yet. The feeling of recognition has a quality to it, a specific warmth, a sense of, yes, of course, of where have you been, that is different from any other kind of knowing. If there were moments in this recording where you felt that quality, where something landed not as new information, but as familiar truth, as something you already knew but had not quite let yourself know you knew, those moments were not accidental. They were contact. Brief, real contact with the layer underneath the layers, with the bedrock we talked about at the beginning, with what the archaeologist finds when the accumulated deposits have been carefully cleared away. That contact does not require you to do anything with it right now. It does not require a plan or a declaration or a dramatic restructuring of your life. It requires only that you do not deny it, that you file it as real rather than as a pleasant thought you had while listening to something, that you give it the same reality status you give to the surface-level evidence that runs in the other direction. Here's the last thing I want to say, and I want you to hear it not as encouragement but as observation, as a plain and honest statement of something that is true. You are not a project. You are not a problem to be solved, or a wound to be managed, or a gap to be bridged, or a first draft waiting for the revision that will finally make it publishable. You are a person, complete in this moment, with everything still uncertain and in process and unresolved. Complete not in the sense of finished, nothing alive is finished, but in the sense of whole, already whole, right now, before another thing changes. The journey from this moment forward is not about becoming enough. It is about removing what has been obscuring the enough that has been there all along. This is not the end of the work. The work continues. It continues tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, in the small choices, and the moments of noticing, and the patient, unheroic practice of returning to yourself each time the drift carries you away. The drift will carry you away. That is not failure. That is weather, and weather passes. What does not pass, what has not passed in all the years you have been searching, is the thing that is doing the searching, the part of you that kept asking, that kept reaching, that paused before pressing play on this recording and chose depth over distraction in a world that is arranged to make that choice nearly impossible. That part of you is not small. That part of you is not damaged. That part of you is not waiting for permission. The mirror under the water is already clear. You have been the one stirring the surface. Stop stirring. Let the water settle. Look down. There you are. There you have always been. Go.